since our last gathering was the survey results. I've gone through myself a couple of times. Of the total survey, there was 224 responses, which I thought was pretty good, considering the difficulty in getting the word out. It works out to a very small percentage of the population, but it had some interesting, and I don't know what everybody else thought, but I thought a couple of things that I noticed that I thought was kind of interesting. On the third page, I noticed that people who responded master's degree or above was like 25%, which it's amazing. So I don't know what that means, except that obviously there's interest in that education level. So it was a good mixture across the board, I thought, as far as people who participated.
Sit where the white signs are. Sit right here.
The other item that I thought was of interest was generally the responses to the sheriff's, what he's done, how he's conducted the department, etc. I thought it was generally positive. I didn't see anything in the survey that indicated otherwise. A reading of the comments that were made give you a sense that there's a mixed feeling about a number of things. Obviously, those things that affect people, I would say most often, like traffic tickets and traffic responses, were expected. The other thing that I noticed that was of interest to me was the problems that people felt were of significance. And we sort of knew it because, at least I think we did, we sort of knew it that the mental health issue was a key issue, along with drug addiction. Those were higher than I thought they would be, but not from what we had heard and what we had gleaned from the public hearings, that there was that those would probably be key areas. The other area that sort of I got mixed messages on was the sheriff's presence in the schools and the DARE program, which seems to me directly related to the drug problem, and how the schools have some of the schools have rejected, or at least have not asked the sheriff's officers to come back, both either as DARE officers or as safety officers. And it seems to me that there was a number of comments made where people were concerned over that, and it seems to me that that's a legitimate issue, to say the least. Those were the ones that sort of hit me between the eyes, as they say. But it seemed to me it was, for the most part, generally positive toward the sheriff's department. And although there was some mixture with regard to the operation of the jail, and that obviously is not necessarily within our purview, so to speak, it seems to me that it does relate to that issue of mental illness, which we need, I think, from what I understand, is being handled to some extent. So I don't know if anybody has any comments on the survey that they dragged out of it, as it were.
So I was glad that the survey was done. I think it was Michelle's idea, or at least suggestion. I learned a lot from that. Much of what you just touched on, Your Honor, I thought was very worthwhile. It's helped at least give me a picture of what's going on out there. As you mentioned, the drug abuse was so high, and I think a lot of the other of an issue, I mean, for the folks. And a lot of those, I don't know what, ancillary ancillary crimes of burglaries and sometimes domestic abuse and DUIs all stem a lot from that. So, with an issue like that, you have an opportunity, if you can lower that, do what you can with that, that can affect a whole host of other areas as well, I believe. So, and then all the other areas you touched on as well, sir. So, I thought it was very well done, I thought it was informative, I'm glad we did it.
Anyone else?
Well, I think the survey shows, one issue we've talked about quite a bit with respect to what we're tasked with here. A lot of the comments relate to funding. How do we pay for a lot of these things? Some people mentioned there should be more sheriff's deputies or understaffed. Well, that's funding. Anything that we do comes back. I mean, it's like the school resource officers and their programs. I serve on the school board, have for many years where I live. We had to get rid of our resource officers. It was, do you keep an English teacher, or do you keep a resource officer? With the cutbacks the state has made, a lot of schools just can't afford it anymore. So even the recommendations we make here, somehow it's going to be, there's going to be a funding issue. Okay, it's great, we know we need to do these things, but how do we pay for it? Especially now during this pandemic that's kind of strapped us for the last year. So I think that's going to be a huge issue.
Do you think that is a recommendation or a report to the county as to it being funded as it were by county funds to maintain that program in the schools? Is that something that, look at the chairman of the legislature who's looking at me with John's eye of creating another expense that obviously the county doesn't need either. But it's clear that at least from what the comments that were made at the end, a couple of areas in the survey, that seemed to be an important thing to people, at least from the point of view of keeping kids informed and hopefully off drugs or stay away from them, as it were.
Sure.
So I don't know how you would form it.
Well, I can tell you that, the 1 year that we did have a resource officer, the sheriff actually basically said, look, I'll take care of it for this year, and then next year we'll discuss how we're gonna pay for it. Then that takes that person off the road. So that's the question, that's one of the questions, when it comes to that is, where do you need them more? I guess looking at it, society probably would say, out on the road where serious type of things happen, but, with the state cutbacks, I can tell you, we're in our budget time now. I just had a meeting last night, and we're starting out our budget year $1.9 million in the hole based on cuts from the state as far as funding is concerned. We've got to figure out how to come up with $1.9 million and not overburden the taxpayers any more than they already are. So it puts you in a very difficult position. As you guys all know, and you look at the tax cap, we started out, I think our tax cap, and our superintendent's made it clear, you will not go over that, is like, our percentage is like 1.3%, so then it's like, you may not even be able to raise taxes high enough to pick up the tab, so then you're laying people off, and you just have to prioritize, so, I don't know if passing that burden on to the county is the answer, because obviously they're in the same hole that everyone else is in.
Well, budgeting is always a problem, but I think we've got maybe two, I don't want to say separate issues here, but I guess are intertwined in the sense that we always have these conversations with the Sheriff's Department on the county level. This is something that the Public Safety Committee or the legislature as a whole has regarding school resource officers. The schools are much responsible as to whether they might even want them or not, whether they pay for them or they don't pay for them. Some of them wouldn't take them for free, don't want them for free, they have their own reasons. Some would like that. But obviously we charge the schools for that because you have so many, not just the budgetary issues, as you talked about, you now no longer have that person on the road. But again, if something does happen, now you've got overtime and shift issues, so all that budget's there. So that's something the legislature and the sheriff, obviously, has to consider for any of these. However, having said that, and not to lock myself into when this comes before the legislature. But having said that, as part of this committee, I think if it's a recommendation that this committee makes, then obviously that would be something that the legislature and the sheriff would consider. I don't want to say it shouldn't be this committee's responsibility to worry about the cost of things, because it should be. But again, recommendations are recommendations, and that will be decided at the legislative level.
Well, it seems to me that that's, it's hard to define what this committee is supposed to do, other than what has been set forth in the Bible here. And so my thought is to draw from you individually or as a group, areas that you think ought to have attention, or at least ought to be looked at more closely, both by the legislature, but also aiding the sheriff in doing some planning himself. Because I don't know whether grants are available, I don't know whether, I mean, that's a whole another bag, so to speak. But I think the approach really is to set a flag out and say, okay, we think it's important that there be resource officers in schools, and any effort made to accomplish that is a good thing. I mean, and so at least it's there. We've recommended it. How you do it and how you mechanically do it, God knows. I mean, like you say, you can't make it appear out of thin air. Anyone else that had?
Yes, so
Yes, dear.
when you read the comments, out of 72 comments, 25% of them mention mental health.
Yes.
And when you read the comments about, and that was to the question, what changes would you like to see implemented to improve safety, controlling, and well-being surrounding the community? In the next questions, there's something we did not ask you that we would like Clinton County Law Enforcement Review Committee, 12% of those comments including mental health. So regardless of officers in the school, something has to be done around mental health. Education with law enforcement, improving mental health, improving responses to mental health. But I think from the survey, it's clear that mental health is probably the top priority, and many of the other issues that highlighted in here are tied in part to behavioral health concerns. So I think that that's a very important thing that we need to make as a recommendation. I think that was clear in the survey.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you. It seems to me that drug abuse, and I know I'm probably get called down on this, but it seems to me that drug abuse to some extent and mental health are connected remotely. I mean,
Not even remotely.
they're there.
They're very
So
interconnected.
it's almost a combined thing. Yeah, I agree. Is there anyone else that has?
It just draws me back to, what I keep thinking about this. So before my days of going to law school, I actually worked for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and at the time they had launched this campaign. They didn't necessarily use the best acronym, but they used to say KGB, which their philosophy at the time was a kinder, gentler bureau, meaning no more busting themselves and going in and slapping guys around that were having issues. It was what can we do to help them, and it all seems to always go back to the educational piece. For years, and Judge, you know this because you worked in the system for years. And not so much the sheriff's department, but most police academies, it's a military-style training where they turn you into what I always refer to as hardened robots. They come out with the V shape, the shaved head, and they're not taught how to deal with people on a daily basis. I think we need to get away from that model with the society and the way we live now. We need to get away from that model and put in there more an educational piece, putting them in situations. Don't just train them what to do when you come into a situation, the person's got a gun pointed at you, but what do you do when you get to a situation the person's in a mental health crisis? And sending the guy in with a big tool belt that has guns and tasers and everything, nightsticks and everything else on it, in a lot of occasions, at least in my experience, it just escalates whatever situation, whatever the situation is. We've just never trained these individuals on how to deal with that.
Well, don't forget that tool belt is there for a reason.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of that's mandated, as you well know. And if you would suggest to take those away.
Oh, no,
And I
no.
don't think that's your suggestion, right?
No.
Okay.
I'm just saying that there should be, in those types of situations, that's where the mental health component would be in it. You could come in where you have someone that you can fall back on and say, look, I'm out at such and such address, and this individual is really going through, mental health crisis. I need a counselor. I don't need to start wrestling around with this person and try to put handcuffs on.
Yes. Well, we talked about that in the CIT meeting,
So
Yeah.
that was similar to it, that again, Rochelle set up, that I thought was very valuable. CIT, the meeting, I thought it was very good, I thought it was very interesting. I think it's something that we can explore. I think as Rochelle said very well, is that it's not something that we would recommend that you adopt this thing like out of whole cloth right now. I think it's a recommendation that could be made, that is explored over time, that's fleshed out, that over probably a couple of years, slowly but surely, with training and other things that Rochelle knows much more than I know.
May I just recap it for?
You basically, very much.
So the crisis intervention team is a statewide initiative to have law enforcement and mental health interface and hope to do diversion from law enforcement responses. One of the things they offered that Mr. Henry was talking about is sequential mapping, and when they come into our county and map where there might be gaps in our law enforcement system where mental health could help, assist, or actually step into place of law enforcement. And they have several different models for programs that work, but the whole point would be for us to create a model that works for us. So a couple examples, and I provided some examples of what like Broome County does. They do a 911 diversion. So right when the calls come to 911, they triage them to law enforcement or mental health. Some other examples include having mental health trained to go out with patrol. Also to have law enforcement officers trained in crisis intervention techniques and be able to respond when possible. So not that we are recommending any of those specific programs. However, I do think it would be worth it if we did the sequential mapping and at least offered the training locally. Law enforcement currently in the academy does 40 hours of mental health training initially, and then I'm not sure if there's any training past that initial 40 hours, which they're learning so much during the academy that it might get lost later down or overtaken by other things that they're learning, especially in a crisis situation. It becomes very difficult to remember those things immediately without practice and constant reinforcement.
I'd like to speak on that for a minute.
Sure.
I actually spoke to my son, and he was part of the DARE program. I quit drinking in '96, and he actually came home and said, Dad, why don't you drink milk? I thought it was nothing. I just quit drinking. Had a difficult time. I put this before him, and he said many things that I never thought of. One of them is, we don't teach our kids in schools, whether they have mental issues or whatever, on how to react to the situations we're talking about. All of a sudden, a police officer may pull you over as you're walking down the street, but we don't teach our children as to how to respect a police officer as he approaches you, whether he's hostile or whatever. If there was a little background on it, he would have a better understanding when he was younger, when it did occur to him, and instead of being angry. It made him angry. I'm not doing nothing and I get pulled over, walking down the street. But one of the things he did come to realize from being involved with the DARE program was that they taught him to always be yes sir, no sir. Speak to somebody with assurity. Don't be angry and don't be aggressive in the way you speak, because their job is important at what they're doing too. You may be a witness to something and they need you, but it looks like they're pulling you over because you committed a crime of some sort. I never thought of that, you know what I mean? I seen a film one time when I was in college of where Green Haven Correctional Facility gave everybody different colors and they put them in different positions. I think what we should do is allocate some sort of program where in schools they're able to do that with the resources that are available. and have them role play so that they know how to respect on both sides of the spectrum and see where they're coming from. I mean, somebody may have a mental issue, but when they witness this, it does stick to them because they realize they're speaking about a police officer informed versus just a regular citizen. So what my suggestion is maybe we should not just be concentrating on law enforcement or the sheriff or even the court systems. I think we should be teaching our kids what it really is, because they don't really know what that profession is or what this police officer's been through when they're, say, 14 to 18 years old. And if we're not teaching them how to say yes sir, no sir, which I'm actually, my military brat, my father was in the Air Force, and that was something he instilled in all of us. And I've gotten a lot of respect by doing that in the 70s and 80s, where a majority of the people that, I come to respect that were in law enforcement came from the idea that I did, speak to them with respect, and a lot of times they were wrong, but we could laugh about it later, even at that same situation, or incident that, occurred. My son also said that if you're teaching the DARE program, you can't just put an employee in there, you have to put somebody that's part of the community and the children feel comfortable with. But when you're dealing with mental health, there's many things that you have to take into consideration. And one of them is you can't just come up with a format or have, hypothetically, the sheriff's department come up with it. It should really implement it amongst the professionals, not the school teachers, but give it to them to show an example as to what it's like to be pulled over, whether you're driving, walking, on a boat, you're in a happy situation at a concert, anything. Because sometimes you're crossing people's boundaries, and that's what they feel. Why are you picking on me? Why did you pick on me out of all these thousands of people here? And I never realized that until my son mentioned that. And I actually called up Dave Favreau and spoke to him on that issue because he was part of the DARE program at that time. And he mentioned to me that I should bring that up for sure because Josh was part of that DARE program. And he did deal with me when I had a TBI and related to me. It was like when I was an alcoholic, So with the mental health issues that are involved today with the drugs, and you have a lot of management drugs that are out there where I personally think myself, I can tell when somebody's on Prozac, opiates. It's not easy today to put, say, just mental health and put a category on just anybody. We all have mental issues, or we have one in our family, or, the scenario is that we're looking here to educate our young and not hurt them. And it's not a racial thing. That I look at it in a perspective, even though I am a black man. I had a situation with my son where he had a car accident in South Carolina in a very bad neighborhood. I just so happened to be sitting with somebody, and he was a state trooper, and we were able to get somebody to go to him, but it was going to take him some time to get there. But by him saying yes sir, no sir, or whatever, he was able to get other officers to, take care of my son until his help arrived. And he stated that to me. He never felt so nervous, after the situation because he said he was wrong. But he said just by him saying yes sir, no sir, and hypothetically he thought, this guy doesn't really care about me, but, he told me that the guy was actually rather nice. So, sometimes we assume things we shouldn't. And that taught, two of us sitting there that day, a very valuable lesson, And my whole scenario on everything that I've read here is that we're in a beautiful community, and I see that, our teachers are capable of implementing some of these programs if we were concrete in the direction of listening to mental health, listening to the sheriff's department. State troopers definitely have a different scenario than you would say a sheriff, because a sheriff may be called to go into more of a mental health situation than a state trooper just pulling someone over. And I think the value of it all is that, you know, I don't think we are training our kids. You know, my son even
Well,
suggested that.
And I'm not sure, I understand what you're saying, and I guess my comment would be, how does the sheriff's department play into that? And the whole, seems to me that the part of the scope of the mandate that we have in the governor's office is to train officers to learn how to de-escalate, deal with bias, identify mental illness, identify drug addiction, domestic violence. I mean, the list is endless. I don't think that they can be teachers of that kind of thing that you're talking about. Teachers could, schools could, and so it seems to me that the police officer's presence in a school is really an identification by children in a school as to what police officers do and what their responsibility is. And oh, by the way, DARE being a something that they can teach, and it's an interaction with kids, works, is at least defines it. So I'm not sure that what you're saying is obviously needed, but I'm not sure this committee can have the sheriff's department do it. Let's go that way.
I don't think any agency, whether it's mental health or the sheriff's department, can do it alone. But I do think that, you know, with there being a resource problem, that they could all put in their, you know, few cents or whatever on the program that is, and let the teachers and the students implement them by role playing, you know, in scenarios, or even once a month or every other month have a sheriff come in.
All I know is the schools right now can't get more than 25% of the student population to participate on a viral education program. So I'm not sure that they can go
You have to
beyond.
throw the viral in there, right?
So one of the really
Virtual, I think.
One of the
Virtual,
really,
yeah.
really important things about having law enforcement is obviously kids' exposure to a friendly environment and an environment that they're safe and comfortable in. That's one of the main things about law enforcement in schools. I think it's a dangerous road if we start teaching kids how to respond, just saying to law enforcement and training them how to respond. And this committee should be doing the opposite, right? Training law enforcement how to respond when someone's not disrespectful to escalate the situation. Right?
Yes, I do agree. I do agree. I just threw in what he said, because I do hear things that he had said that made a lot of sense, because of the simple fact that some kids are intimidated easily when they're young. And, you know. And
I think that's a legitimate point of view, in the sense that our survey says, I think that along the respect issue, is that people felt more discriminated by civilians in their
Yeah, that
daily
was the
lives,
other- yeah.
as opposed to the police. And that was followed closely. The police were almost tied with businesses. So it seems to be, I mean, I know we're here to talk about police departments, I get that, and that's what we should talk about. But it seems to be almost not just an issue for police that people think, but it runs across society. That they're saying that civilians and businesses are doing it, to a greater extent than the police.
I hear you, and that was a point I intended to make
Yes, sir.
as well. Was that bit of information that sort of surprised me, because obviously the survey was geared toward and pointing at the sheriff's department, and when they made that response, and the civilian response of bias was stronger than the
Yes,
sheriff's.
yeah, as you said earlier, but I was relating those remarks to teaching, you know, and if the sheriff's department is welcome into a school through their program or whatever, that may be an opportunity to help them, but perhaps it can also cut across all of society, educate everyone.
not to be devious, but one of the things that I've done, and I think some others have as well, I met with the sheriff's department this past week, and I was, matter of fact, I spent 2 hours there, going through their protocols and procedures, and I was, number one, amazed at the detail that they have with respect to each function that they do. For example, they have a section of protocol and procedures with regard to the issuance of warrants, service of warrant. Now, you might say, well, I view this, I just go out and hand it to the guy. But they have it codified in a way that appears on their telephone. They can read it. In other words, if an officer out in the field has a question as to how he should proceed under certain circumstances, issuing a warrant or service process, whatever the case may be, he can refer to that. He has that capability of having it in his hand or on the computer in his car to get those protocols squared away. And I was impressed by that because it seemed to me that if there's a question in an officer's mind when he's at a scene, and I realize that sometimes those scenes are moving more quickly than you can to bring up something on your computer. But the protocols and procedures that were that have been established in the sheriff's office, and that comes through the New York State Sheriff's Association, are remarkable. And anybody who wants to go up and see them can go see them. No matter make an appointment with the sheriff's department, and I believe me, it was well worth the experience, at least from my point of view. We discussed an ultimate report to the legislature, and I asked him, the sheriff, to go through the elements that have been laid out in the collaborative report. In other words, the areas that it asks us to look at, and rather than reinvent the wheel, it may already have been done. To some extent, it has been done, and so that way there we can have a document. Rather, we're not being redundant, or we're not duplicating a recommendation. We are moving the envelope a little further down the road, and so. My thought is that if you have issues that you have gleaned from what we've heard from the public, what we've gleaned from the survey, what you've done in talking about it, that we air it here now, if we can, or at some other meeting. And then when the sheriff produces his report, which is basically a listing, I think Steuben County the sheriff's department did one, which I have. I don't know if I've given it to everybody, but I can. It encapsulates or capsulizes in a short message what has been done in relation to that issue in the department, how it's being handled, and then is it complete? In other words, has the department completely covered the issue by way of training, by way of protocol, by way of whatever the case would be, and if not, when it will be completed. And it seemed to me that I didn't want to get into a situation where we as a committee go off in a direction that's already been, how you say, covered by the sheriff's office in its internal workings with the New York State Sheriff's Association. Not that, and believe me, he never indicated to me that it was perfect. That wasn't the point. But I was truly impressed by the organization of the protocols and procedures that he had listed with each general subject that the sheriff's department gets into. For example, issue of a warrant, service of a warrant, or whatever. Those things are important both by way of interaction, but also safety as well. And so the accreditation process that's ongoing as well. Apparently, there's a preview coming up shortly from the Sheriff's Association, in which they come in and check all these procedures and protocols and so forth, to make sure that they comply with the governor's suggestions and what is already on the books as far as laws are concerned. So that process will go through, and then they will either certify it or not. And there's two more, I believe there's two more rounds of accreditation that have to take place. So some of the things, or some of the answers, I think, to the questions that are in the manual will be answered, or at least identified and quantified, I should say, by the sheriff in his report to us. And that way there we can go from there. I just didn't want to be redundant and have, okay, we're going to do this kind of program when there's something cooking already. So that was my thought. One of the other things that came up, and it seems to me to be a good idea, and it may fit with the CIP thing, is to have an in-house mental health individual in the jail, and that would allow them to deal with the issues that are there, or help with the issues that are there, but also could be out on call. So somebody, if they come to work 8 hours a day or whatever, be on call in the evening or whenever, so that the deputies could call on them to come out to a scene or come to a scene at the time they go out. So at least there's a resource available to the deputy in process. He said, I'm not sure how that all works and how it would be established, but obviously it's a county charge, and all the rest of the things that Jamie spoke about. So it seemed to me that there's some vehicles that can be used that will improve the service that the department is providing. And they're concerned, at least I got the impression, they're concerned with the mental illness and drug issue as well, because it's as broad as it is wide, and you never know what you have. And these, and I've said this before, you have a 23-year-old fella who's a new deputy. His life experiences haven't been what you call expansive. And so any help that he can get, and I was really impressed by the ability to call up, what do I do under these circumstances, that's available to them by computer. The other area that I think, at least I got an impression of, was the body cam, dash cam program. And I learned more about that too. Apparently they have had body cams and dash cams for some time. And they also have internal cameras in their vehicles, which aid and assist, I said, she said, or I did, he did kind of issues. The problem with it is the storage of that information, or being able to provide it. And he said if the rule was, he meaning the sheriff, said if the rule was that it must be disseminated within 10 days, that's not a problem. But the discovery is, I'm sure Jamie is much longer than that. And they have no way of storing it. So it seems to me that some exploration has to be done, or should be done, a recommendation that we made, that body cams and dash cams be supported, because they help both the officer and the potential victim with regard to it. It seems to me that it's a win-win, but for the discovery problem. How that's done, and apparently the discovery, the storage is incredibly expensive, from what I have seen. What else I can ask? I mean, the ones that I have sort of gleaned have been mental illness, drug use, domestic violence, bias and racism, internal discipline, body cameras and dash cams, policies and protocols. I don't know if there's other issues that you have, through your processes, have come up with. That's that's where I'm at. Mr. Castine, you've been quiet over there.
I learn more when I listen than when I talk.
Well, that is true, and I learned a lot in the last few days, but if anybody is thinking or planning on, has the opportunity to make an appointment with the sheriff's office to go through these protocols and policies, I would recommend it highly. It's well organized into subjects and areas, and like I said, I don't, if there's other issues that you feel you have, I'm happy to obviously include them in whatever you put together, but I'm concerned that I don't want him to go through all this work, putting this together, and then turn around and you do something. I just thought that, and frankly, the brevity of the Steuben County one, and I can get copies to everybody of that, just so you can understand what I'm talking about. I'll have copies made of that and get it out to you. But it seemed to me to encapsulate a response that was provable and put your fingers on to each one of the items listed in the order that we should talk about, or at least that should be discussed. So I don't know if anybody has anything else to come before the other thought I had, the other thing I need, I guess, I'm thinking of getting, if I could get recommendations from you or areas of concern other than what I already have here, by the 19th. And I would try and put, I hopefully will get from the sheriff his report, and I'm thinking of having a draft recommendation to you folks by the 26th. And we can dissect it, add to it, et cetera, at that time. Does that sound like a reasonable thing to do? The CIT, they meet regularly? Because I really have missed that.
Yeah, so they are a training program by the state, and they will come to our county and walk us through that process and partners.
It sounds to me like what you were describing, it sounds to me that the best way of dealing with that would be to have a general recommendation that the sheriff's department participate with the CIT in its.
I think our county participates with CIT, it would just be the sheriff's department.
Okay.
All law enforcement. I had discussed this about two or 3 years ago with all of law enforcement about running a program like this to work mental behavioral health in general. I think a couple recommendations, you said mental health, we do provide clinicians at the sheriff's department for 17 hours a week. I do think full-time would be helpful. We do also provide assistance with addictions and MAT at the jail. So they have those, I think they need to be reinforced, but I also believe if we do something with CIT, having that mapping so we can actually identify, with empirical data, what the gaps and needs are, where we can do better, and we've got other examples from that. I think having someone, a physician or a person that can help respond to crisis during the day, because the people in the jail we don't want to take out into the community, and strengthen that with some of the existing providers and services, I think would be very helpful. I like your idea of how they have stuff on the phone, so I don't know if maybe we do a mental health or substance abuse or behavioral health to do,
That's
that they
what I
have
was-
access to
that's what I was
immediately.
thinking.
And contact information. So
Right.
we're sitting there and they're like,
Who do
oh,
they
what do I
call?
do? Oh, I can call this person, they can, at least if nothing else, will walk me through.
Like I said, if you have a chance, and I know everybody's got so much time available, the meeting with the sheriff's office to go through that was eye-opening in my opinion. And the more I looked at it, the more it seemed to me that there was responses and answers that we, recommendations that we would make are not necessary. But it would list it so that everybody knows where they are, what they are, and who's running it. I guess again, it's one of those things where, information is where you get it, and I just was impressed by the system. Not only the breakdown of each duty of the officer, but also his responsibility to coordinate within that system and report. And they have a review program where if an incident occurs, once it's resolved, then they have a breakdown as to what happened, how can be improved, et cetera. So some of the stuff is already in place, and the breadth and width of it is what I'm trying to determine. And so it's the kind of thing where once he has put together where he fits in the plan and where he is in completing those things, and some of the things will be done, some will not be done, or some can't be done, but he will at least line them out so that we have a handle on it and we can go from there. That's my thought at the moment. So
The
I think,
other thing, I'm sorry, the CIT brings is training. So I think by the surveys that it's clear that additional training on responding to mental health would be an important recommendation. I
Yeah.
don't know what the sheriff's direction is for that, but I know that it seems like that people are asking for that. And I know CIT will bring that as well. It doesn't have to be CIT. Maybe the sheriff
now
has.
does that program also include social services, that kind of thing, where you got child abuse, or do they deal with that as well? I'm thinking resourcing other parts of the county, social service department, child protective unit.
Yeah, we definitely could do a resource that they have right on their phone, and we already have some of that. The library system has done a wonderful app with all sorts of resources. So just familiarizing with that could definitely be part of the plan. But I think we do need train additional behavioral training.
And we should pull probation on that too, because they deal with a lot of these people on a daily basis.
Well, that's in the ideal world, it would all be connected and we'd have enough people to respond. But to me, sometimes it's a matter of a phone call and somebody saying, hey, we already have this person in view, we can be there in 15 minutes, or we can't be, or whatever the case may be. I think it was brought up at one of the meetings, is how different each of these incidences are, that you can't possibly put a complete policy together that's going to cover every situation.
Oh, yeah.
It's not going to happen. We're dealing with human beings here that vary from top to bottom, so it's not a question. So I guess if you folks have particular interests or particular issues that you want to at least give the legislature notice of, then if I can get them by the 19th, that would be great. And with that, I should by that time have the sheriff's report, which I will pass out to you, and I will get everybody a copy of Sioux County's report as well. Yes, sir.
One of the things that was brought up yesterday at the CIT meeting was that the problem is, if we're dealing with mental health, you can diffuse that situation, and that person who's suffering that mental health incident, there's not a darn thing we can do. You bring him to the hospital. If he doesn't sign himself in, he's right back out on the street. And I don't know if our committee is set up to answer that type of question, but unless you can go beyond that incident and at least put an end to it for that particular day,
Yeah.
you're not solving anything. If
I
you
guess-
get me up and I say I'm not gonna sign myself in, I beat the cop back out on the streets.
One
When
of
this
the-
happens.
One of the things I noticed here with this is a Q&A that goes on when the call comes in, so that the person receiving the call can sort of decipher what that person who's complaining or bringing this to the police attention or to 911 attention can focus on it. And so the person who's answering the 911 call, I see we lost a long timer that was there for forever. But that person needs to be trained to sort of understand and decipher what a person who's in a panic trying to say to them. If Joe is on the bridge and he's about to jump, okay, but how did they get there, and is it too late to do it, anything about it or not? I mean, those are all the kinds of things that go on. So that training at who answers that phone at 911 is another area that is, and is that state funded, or is that county funded? Yeah. So at least we have I don't know what the training is for the 911. Like I said, I'm learning.
CIT does that in one county. In front of you, I have an example of what Blue County does to triage the 911 calls. So one of those colored sheets shows what their protocol is and their trainings. And then if I go back to Mr. Castine, so what Major Leon was talking about, it's called a 941 or 945 order. So if someone has a behavioral health issue that poses imminent risks to themselves or someone else, the police can transport them to the hospital against their will, or I can issue an order to transport them to the hospital against their will. It does guarantee a crisis evaluation in the emergency room and to see a crisis counselor, but after that, it's really at the discretion of the hospital. So that is a frustrating part of the system, and we work with it often, but the point is making sure that there's good communication with the hospital so we can wrap around and make sure services are in place coming in or out. But that's a large systems discussion, but that I think was Major Leon's frustration, but it does guarantee minimally a crisis eval, where if you just sign yourself in, you won't get a crisis eval. So they are mandated to stay there by order until they see a crisis clinician or a psychiatrist.
And 9 times out of 10, they're back on the street right after they see that person because they won't sign themselves in, and the hospital won't sign them in either.
It depends on the circumstance, right? Yeah.
Rochelle, let me ask you a question, see how you feel about this. It's one of the things that I thought about as far as a recommendation is concerned, is, and maybe I'm not using the best way of describing it, but like a public advocate. We've all seen the ads on TV around the holidays about don't drink and drive. It could cost you your life, it could cost you $10,000 in fine. But you never see anything on there that says, hey, if you're in a crisis, and I'm saying the sheriff department can do this, if you're in a crisis, here's the things we can do to help. In the drinking and driving ones, they show the sheriff on there and the troop commander from state police and the DA is on the commercial, so that they show that the system works together. We can do something similar with the sheriff's department or mental health professionals, to say, look, if you or someone you know is having problems, mental health issues or drug addiction issues, there is a team here that can provide you help, or this is the number you can call where you can get help, because a lot of people just don't know, and in these tough times, or they think, like, if I don't have a nickel in my pocket, I can't get help because I don't have the money to go get help. And that shouldn't be, it's not the thing that should stop them, because there is help available even if you can't afford to pay for it.
I think going back to one of the things you mentioned, the problem is many law enforcement individuals don't know the resources necessarily in our community, and so they're kind of put people off with what their needs are, right?
Well, we look at it from, and I think even this group has, we've looked at it from a criminal standpoint, where law enforcement's dealing with people if they're having mental health issues because some type of a crime's been committed. I look at it from this standpoint. I've had clients back in their private practice days that needed mental health assistance because they were being evicted from their apartment. The sheriff's deputy's there because the law requires only the sheriff's department can actually evict somebody with a warrant. And they're standing there telling the people, start carrying your stuff out to the street corner, and that person's having a crisis, they're addicted to drugs, it's why they couldn't pay their rent. And it could be as simple as, here's this brochure that can help you, where you can get temporary housing, you can get in touch with a counselor, any of those things.
That's where.
They don't know that.
Social worker or someone working at the sheriff's department, then they can make those referrals and that
Yeah.
person can connect them with
You know, well, like you said, either create it so they can pull it up on their phone and say, hey, if you need emergency housing tonight, you've got nobody, this is the number you need to call.
And one step up from that is connecting them with a person that's gonna follow through.
Yes.
In that moment, with a piece of paper, they might not follow
Yep.
through. I just wanna remind everyone that people with mental health issues are
Yeah,
more
they-
likely to be victims of a crime than.
So they have some way, the deputy himself had some way of logging that. And it was a full-time social worker at jail, they could say, look, I dealt with this person today, and I really think they need help, but I'm not sure they're gonna follow up with you. That person could then follow up.
So we're working on that program. You might not. We, Essex County has launched a program called Lemurs, where any law enforcement agent who comes across someone that they feel needs mental health or addiction help, I have a call tomorrow, can reach out and calls, sends a referral form, so they create a web-based form that goes to Essex County Mental Health, and then they pick it up and do outreach and try to connect them with services. I think it's a wonderful, simple program, doesn't cost any money, and I actually have a meeting about it tomorrow, to tie it with, substance abuse as well and opioid.
Because I know when I was in the DA's office over there, through our treatment court, we created a program, and even the state police bought into it, but it was for veterans. They were arresting someone who said they had prior military service and, whatever was going on in their life. As part of our packet, we got that information, so that we knew that there may be a mental health component or a substance abuse component that we had to help with.
So your honor, that would be a good recommendation as well. It doesn't cost anything.
Well,
But I'll send it to you.
somewhere along the line, we had to start that process of based on gleaning what we've been able to glean from the survey, from what we've heard from the public, what other counties are doing. I mean, I guess I show you, we have Washington County, is Niagara? Niagara, that's theirs. Now, there's a lot of nothing in here too. But, and then you have students. So I mean, that's the range of what's going on out there as far as the report or recommendation to the legislature is concerned. I like the student, and I'll have the office send everybody a copy of it. I like the student's report because it gives the status of what the sheriff is doing now in conformity with what the governor asked as far as chokeholds and all, the whole 9 yards. Is it in place? Is it not? When will it be? And so there's things running parallel here. The Sheriff's, New York State Sheriff's Association, which runs the accreditation, is keenly aware of what the governor has requested to be done. And so their accreditation process includes that. Now, COVID happened in the meantime, and that sort of slowed the process down. But hopefully, the accreditation ought to be done by the end of, I think, early 22. So if that's the case, but at least you'll have things you have to consider and things you don't have to consider, or at least things that we improved. Obviously, we've hit one that I think is clear, and that's the mental health area. And obviously, you're on top of it. So I know that you also handle the lights and everything else, but that's okay. We can, I'd like to, if I can get recommendations that you have, then I can share with you what the sheriff sends me, and we'll go from there, okay? Yes, sir.
Pat, we can't lose sight of why this committee was started in the first place. We had a whole summer full of racial unrest because of the riots and a couple of incidents that happened across the country. Are we addressing the biased portion of this, that officers
I
are
think
trained
you're gonna-
to know that whether he's coming for a white person or a black person or
I think you're
Oriental
gonna,
or whatever, that it's the same response?
I think you're gonna find that what the sheriff puts together and what has been put together by other deals with that issue. And they have, like I said, they have reviews of situations that they internally review, et cetera. There's always a question of whether there should be a review commission that reviews complaints against deputies, whether it should be done internally or whether it should be done publicly. Those are all things that I think we'll be able to fine tune once we get the sheriff's report. But that's an area that it has pluses and minuses. If you expose a deputy to having done something, quote, wrong, is he tarred and feathered for the rest of his days? I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities that end up with difficulties. And you have a history of more than one incident. I mean, if you look at the records of the fellows that committed the acts against Floyd George, the guy had 10 or 15 prior complaints dealing with the same kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, we need to know that this stuff is in place so it doesn't come to that type of
Exactly,
situation.
and that's why, you know, everybody speaks about it differently, but that's the kind of thing that needs to be, how you say, protocols for, so that one, the deputy is protected as well as the complainant under the circumstances, because it's an ongoing thing. And so, like I said, if you have a chance to go out and take meet with them and go through that, it's well worth the educational experience. At least I found it to be incredibly enlightening, as it were.
I think from our first meeting on the base there with Sheriff Favreau and Major Leon gave their presentation, I think this stuff was pretty well covered.
It was covered
addressing this, and
it was covered in a way that well, for example, I spent 2 hours there last week, and that thing that he presented was about an hour, I think. I'm not sure. But that was very superficial, what he showed. I mean, based on what I've seen, I've simply sit there going, oh, that's handled that way. Oh, I understand that. I mean, it's that kind of a thing. So if I'm sure that he would welcome anybody from the community that wants to go out and take a peek, and the public can go as far as that's concerned, and make an appointment to go out and review it. I think it's well worth the price of time spent. So I don't want to set another meeting date unless you want to, but I'm thinking if I can get your thoughts in here on the 19th, by the 19th, then I can hopefully get a draft done, or at least have another meeting by the 26th to review the sheriff's information, and we'll go from there. All right.
That makes sense to me. I think too, and you touched on it, Judge, is that for the purposes of our discussion here, it's good that we get down in the weeds for the CIT program or the internal discipline program or any of that, so that folks can understand what we're thinking about, what we're discussing. But when we make our recommendations, we don't have to make recommendations and this is what we want to do from the time the call comes in to the time you handle it through the dispatcher and the training. I think we give them that, you know, just, we'd like to see internal discipline improve, you know, whatever that 3 sentences is. And then leave that up to the folks that come after us to implement it.
Our job is to make recommendations based on what we perceive as being shortcomings or improvements that the department can install or fulfill. The wording might say, we would recommend that the county seriously look into the CIT program with regard to the sheriff's department and its procedures, or a similar program of some kind. I mean, there may be others out there. The New York State Sheriff's Association may have one, etc. So at least you're having input coming in that allows the legislature to fashion what it thinks it can do or what's available. Because I'm learning this as I go, as we all are, and it is broad as it is wide. I mean, what's happened in the sheriff's department has been absolutely amazing since the time I was county attorney. I mean, it's a different ballgame entirely.
They have lights down there now, John.
Yeah, they're not riding horses. But there are so many areas. I mean, I'm thinking the marine area, the Lake Champlain. I mean, that's a whole different, ballgame. We have a border that a lot of counties don't have. Sudan County doesn't have. So we have a 150-mile lake on one side of us. So we're unique in a lot of ways, and so that we need this recognized. I think we have recognized the problem. The question is what is being done and how can we improve it? And I'm hoping that the sheriff puts together what he's done and whether it's complete or not, and we'll decide whether it's complete or not and whether it needs improvement. I mean, that's the way I look at it.
Good, I have a question, Bruce.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you would be willing to accept public recommendations through email before the 19th?
I'm happy to accept anything that wants to come in. My problem is that I don't want to reinvent the wheel. It's already there. And so my hope is that the sheriff's response, and I have no idea what his response is going to be, will help us in answering the question of, well, is this sufficient? From what we know, is this sufficient? Is he installed in his operation sufficient training, sufficient procedures, protocols, etc., to answer that question, or at least protect the individual in the street as well as the deputy? That's what I'm trying to do. So I just don't want to take a shotgun approach and say, okay, let's start over from scratch, and just because the sheriff, the New York State Sheriff's Association has really done a lot of things pre-Cuomo, Albany County Sheriff, Albany County's report was 3 pages long. Now, I don't know how you can cover what the Cuomo director said in 3 pages. I just don't know how you can do it. And yet, Niagara County comes out with 140 pages. So that's the scope of what's going on here. Now, is there real content in that 140 pages? I don't know. But it's the kind of thing that you sit there and go, wait a second, how can you have such a broad spectrum? Well, you're sitting here with Niagara County is a little bit bigger than Clinton, and so you have different problems. But I don't have a problem with any recommendation from anybody. I really don't. We'll digest them and we'll correlate them and send up the flagpole and see if they fly. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned that there is policies already to cover, or like there are protocols happening to make it so that like when there's racial, when there's incidents of race, that they have the training, I think it's my understanding, or that there's training in place already. But does the public really know about those type of trainings, so like people feel safe?
That's part of what is going on here, is that, yes, sheriff's departments are independent departments. I mean, the sheriff's office is a constitutional office. And so he has internal things that he does. He's guided, as I understand it, obviously by the law, with the criminal procedure law and the criminal code, but he's also guided by the New York Sheriff's Association. So some of that stuff is he doesn't necessarily want to disclose, okay, and has reasons for it, and that aren't necessarily concerned with the public, but maybe concerned with criminal activity that may have some benefit by knowing that information. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. But the idea is to go through what the current status of the department is, what they're doing as far as training is concerned, their procedures and policies. I'm assuming that what the sheriff will come up with is the status of Clinton County Sheriff's Department in relation to the issues raised by the governor. that will aid and assist us in not necessarily going over something that's already been established and working. Training programs, reporting, writing up of incidences, all those things that go into operating the sheriff's department need to be done. I mean, we can't not do that. Question might be is, do we have a public commission that reviews the actions of deputies in some way? Doesn't necessarily have to be public, or maybe it's public, partially public, I don't know. Those are the things that don't necessarily exist now, but could exist and aid and assist in confidence that you have deputies that are well-trained, understand the demographics of the community, understand how they're to treat other people, black, white, yellow, whatever the case may be, in an appropriate way, so that people aren't getting hurt because simply they're of color or they're being stopped. I mean, some of the things that came out in the survey were people who were stopped by identification. In other words, they saw a black man driving a car. Well, he either was breaking law or he wasn't. But then the purpose wasn't that. The purpose was to find out whether he had drugs in the car or that he was, that type of thing. But simply because he was stopped, simply because he was black or whatever. So it's those kinds of things that we're trying to get at. And how do you change a person's mind? Somebody said it, I think it was, is everybody's biased to some extent. It's about something. Now, some are more biased than others, obviously. But, we're trying to neutralize the biasness, if you want to call it that, of officers who are under stress. I mean, traffic is one thing, but going into a domestic violence situation is a wholly different ballgame. Because who knows who the players are, and whether they got guns and whether they don't have guns, and all those things. And decisions have to be made in 15 seconds. As somebody pointed out, it takes 3 months to try the case, or a year to try the case. It takes a jury of 12 people, a bunch of attorneys, and a judge to figure out the ultimate conclusion. He's got to decide in 15 minutes. That's easy for me to say, that's easy for somebody to say, but so that's what we're trying to do, and we're not trying to befuddle anyone. It doesn't take much to befuddle me anyway. So. Anything else? Well, we're on the mission. Okay. Stay tuned. If you have anything of consequence that you feel we ought to add to the list, or improve on the list, or the 19th would be great. And I may, if the sheriff's office, the thing comes in the meantime, I'll get that out. Okay? You bet. Thank you all.